I went to Korea and drove a hydrogen-powered vehicle. We see Hyundai has a 250-mile, 20-minute reach.
With over $100 billion in write-downs in electric vehicle, and 12 car prices have exploded. The median car price has increased by 50% since 2020.
So the technology is there.
It's impossible to invest without clear law.
미국 하원 청문회 도중 꽤 신기한 장면이 포착됐습니다. 한 의원이 대한민국에서 직접 수소차를 몰아봤다며 현대차의 구체적인 성능 수치를 근거로 이야기를 꺼낸 겁니다.
At the core of the Clean Air Act is the idea that we can protect our environment without sacrificing economic growth. But it's been decades since Congress updated the Act, causing many of its outdated provisions to become burdensome and counterproductive to its original goals. That's why this committee is considering nuanced and tailored updates to improve the Clean Air Act. Today, we will consider 10 pieces of legislation that aim to provide common sense updates to Title II of the Clean Air Act, which governs mobile sources. I welcome feedback from our witnesses and others as the committee considers these bills. I also would like to thank Representative Fedorchik and Representative Langworthy for their work on these bills and their leadership in modernizing the mobile source provisions of the Clean Air Act. The witnesses we will hear from today have extensive experience with the challenges presented by out-of-date provisions and are well suited to explain their impact. I look forward to their testimony on the discussion drafts and legislation. I'm particularly interested in testimony that relates to the continued use of the California waiver in the Clean Air Act. One of the bills we will consider today epitomizes the concerns of the committee. The Locomotives Act, introduced by Representative LaMaffa and championed by Representative Olbernolte, illustrates the problematic outcomes associated with the waiver. In 2023, the California Air Resources Board proposed a rule that would ban the operation of any locomotive 23 years or older from operating in California unless it is running on a zero emissions configuration. The proposed rule, issued in the twilight of the Biden-Harris presidency, was withdrawn before the current administration took office, but it would have effectively prohibited 67% of the national locomotive fleet from entering California and accessing two of the nation's largest.
이런 발언이 나온 건 현재 미국의 법 제도가 너무 낡았기 때문입니다. 환경 보호를 위해 만든 법이 수십 년간 방치되면서 이제는 항만과 물류 현장에 오히려 큰 부담을 주고 있습니다.
And when the law has been allowed to work to provide long-term regulatory certainty and drive technology innovation, Americans have benefited tremendously. Investments in research have enabled the development of pollution control technologies, including selective catalytic reduction that have improved fuel economy and allowed liquid fuels to become less polluting. Zero-emission vehicles have also seen major improvements in performance and cost reductions in recent years, which has also reduced pollution and lowered Americans' dependence on fossil fuels. Today, thanks to President Trump's unnecessary war with Iran, American drivers are feeling pain at the pump. Gasoline is over $4.25 per gallon, and diesel is well over $5. Americans have already spent $51 billion more on gasoline and diesel since the beginning of Trump's war, and many of those costs are being passed on to people, regardless of whether or not they drive, through higher grocery prices and other increases to their cost of living. Reducing Americans' dependence on volatile fuel markets is exactly why a steady, long-term transition away from polluting vehicles is so economically beneficial. EPA's own analysis of its repeal of clean vehicle standards confirms this. By keeping Americans dependent on the fossil fuels, it will cost us some $1 trillion more in gasoline by 2055. Unfortunately, over the past 18 months, we have seen a very concerning trend at EPA and among Republicans in Congress to upend the Clean Air Act's proven track record of delivering cost-effective public health improvements and economic benefits. In February, EPA rescinded the endangerment finding and repealed all greenhouse gas emission standards for vehicles. EPA has also announced a reconsideration of 2024 standards for traditional pollutants.
물론 기준만 명확했다면 기술 발전으로 얻을 혜택이 컸을 겁니다. 하지만 최근 환경보호청의 방침이 갈지자로 바뀌면서 현장의 혼란이 커지고 있습니다.
Fortunately, Congress stepped in and passed bipartisan legislation to block California's electrification mandates. This failed regulatory push has resulted in one of the greatest misallocations of capital in U.S. history. with over $100 billion in write-downs in electric vehicle investments so far. This regulatory overreach is a good inflection point to reform Title II. Here are 3 suggestions for Congress. First, Title II needs to be cleaned up. Title II is over 100 pages long and contains many outdated provisions and programs pertaining to vehicles and fuels in the 1970s or 1990s. Congress should repeal provisions that have outlived their purpose. Second, California's waiver needs to be reformed. The extreme smog that justified the highly unusual waiver in the 1960s is a thing of the past. In my view, Congress should simply repeal California's waiver authorities going forward for future model years, placing California on an equal footing with every other state, consistent with the principle of equality among the states. Third, Title II should clearly prohibit EPA from considering electric vehicles when setting standards for internal combustion vehicles. Seismic industrial policies should be debated and enacted, if at all, by this body and not EPA. I welcome your question.
I thank all of you for your testimony. We will now move to the question and answer portion of the hearing. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, the chairman of the Energy Subcommittee, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes for his questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our witnesses for coming before the subcommittee today. Mr. Conda, last Congress, we passed the CARS Act, which seeks to prevent the EPA from implementing any future vehicle emissions regulations that would mandate certain technologies or engine types. We have heard testimony today claiming the current administration is solely responsible for the decrease in electric vehicle purchases. Would you expand on your point about the auto manufacturers' write-downs and what this is about Americans' interest in buying certain cars unless the government mandates them or takes the alternative?
특히 전기차 규제를 무리하게 밀어붙였다가 $1,000억 넘는 투자 손실을 봤다는 비판이 쏟아집니다. 정작 소비자의 수요는 읽지 못한 채 규제에만 매달렸다는 지적인데요.
For his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would certainly say we got an upgrade. Mr. Conde, in 1967, amendments to the Clean Air Act allowed the federal government to raise preemption for the state of California. While this may have been necessary at the time, your testimony highlights that California's waiver is presently outdated, and I'll say way outdated. Can you explain to what California's current waiver authority impacts the emission standards and regulations in other states, as well as interstate commerce at large?
Yes, so in 1967, Congress enacted a particular waiver authority that's pretty unique that allows California to set emission standards within its state. But then in 1977, Congress further amended the act to allow other states in the country to adopt California standards. And this in practice means that California has a veto over manufacturer production decisions in about 1/3 of the market, which effectively means the whole national market. So that gives California enormous regulatory authority.
Well, absolutely it does.
Yeah.
And is there something to be said that all of these regulations serve more so to drive the cost of vehicles as well as freight and delivery and fuel higher than it has such a small impact on curbing emissions in a small way? Is that safe to say?
That is very safe to say.
Ms. Ferguson, would you agree with that?
Yes, I would.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to come back to you, Mr. Conde, I think is where I'm going next. I have a district along the Gulf Coast of Texas that is home to several key waterways. We have 7 ports, a lot of manufacturing, a lot of refining on the Gulf Coast of Texas. We serve as a lifeline to not only our country's energy export trade, and also import in a lot of things, and import a lot of trade in there in the Gulf Coast of Texas. As such, our inland waterways remain an absolutely crucial linchpin to our nation's transportation.
더 답답한 건 캘리포니아라는 특정 지역의 기준이 미국 자동차 시장 전체의 생산 방식과 가격까지 결정하고 있다는 사실입니다.
Mr. Conde, let me ask you, in your testimony you discussed the need to clean up Title II to outdated provisions and programs that were designed for vehicles and fuels from decades ago. What are the consequences if we don't do that? What are the consequences if we leave Title II as they are?
There's a lot of confusion, so a lot of attorneys are going to be making a lot of money poring over pages that are no longer relevant to the actual public. So it has a lot of costs to businesses who are just trying to figure out what the law is and what it means.
Good. Mr. Ferguson, you brought up some pretty interesting points in your testimony particularly regarding the challenges of bus operators that they face in places like New York City. Routine operational activities that are needed for passenger safety and even ADA compliance are now being weaponized and expanded through predatory citizen complaint programs, similar to what you just referred to. Mr. Ferguson, what can we do in Congress to ensure that bus operators are not taken advantage of for simply doing their job and working to keep passengers safe?
Well, the Bipartisan Buses Act, which has been spearheaded by Mr. Langworthy and Mr. Gottheimer, is a great place to start. It gives operators the framework to complete their pre-trip safety inspections to allow time to get the systems, the sensors, the lifts, everything up and running as it should, which promotes and encourages safety in the operation of a motor coach, which on average takes about 35 individual cars off the road.
Is this the Bus Idling Act that you're referring to?
Yes, sir.
Good. It seems to me like some of these oppressive policies stem from our outdated Clean Air Act and may actually lead to less bus travel and put more cars on the road. We could shoot ourselves in the foot, wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. And we've seen 35% of our operators in the East Coast are reducing trips into New York City because of this idling enforcement program, which, as I stated in my testimony, does not apply to transit or other movers of people such as taxi cabs or ride shares. Only the private motor coach industry is targeted under this program.
법이 현실을 따라가지 못해 억울한 피해자가 생기는 일도 잦습니다. 승객 안전을 위해 당연히 해야 할 일을 했는데도 낡은 규정 때문에 단속 대상이 된 버스 사업자들의 사례가 대표적입니다.
Industry and consumers, we've talked about this in the context of methane, are tired of the regulatory ping pong between Republican and Democratic administrations. It's impossible to invest without clear laws, create newer, cleaner, and smarter products. And I would just call out the CARS Act for one example, would block EPA from finalizing vehicle emission standards that would mandate the use of specific technology or, quote, result in the limited availability of new motor vehicles. That is so broad and vague that it could hamper EPA's ability to promulgate any future rules in the future. Now, none of these bills are going to get 60 votes in the Senate, so the administration will be forced to do them unilaterally, and then a Democratic president will unwind them. I do think we should work in this room on real fixes. And meanwhile, with respect to cars, China is building 20 electric vehicle dealerships in Canada and looking to open car manufacturing plants in Mexico. All this talk about dissing electric vehicles is ignoring that is where the world is going, and we should be leading, not giving it away, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Iowa for her 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this important hearing, and I also want to thank our witnesses for being here today. It's interesting to hear my colleagues speak, so I agree with Representative Buddy Carter that we have regulations that were put in place almost half a century ago and need to be modernized. And I also agree with Representative Peters that sometimes we hear that a regulation will be so onerous that it will eliminate an industry. And so I think that
정권이 바뀔 때마다 기준이 계속 뒤집히니 기업들은 투자를 망설일 수밖에 없습니다. 이대로라면 세계 시장의 주도권을 다른 나라에 다 뺏길 수 있다는 경고가 나옵니다.
This proposal would give industry a pass at modernizing their technology and the efforts to reduce emissions from decades-old, outdated rail technology. And in fact, Sierra Club has been pushing for cleaner trains for many, many years. We have shined a light on the inexcusable delay for updating rail technology. And one of the things that is clear to me, doing a landscape of where rail technology is around the world, this is not an issue of technology. This is an issue of prioritization, and this is a prioritization challenge. If we were to invest in updating rail technology and electrifying rail, that would have huge benefits for populations that are living around rail yards, and particularly the rail yards and the corridors between the ports and throughout the Los Angeles region. We can deploy electric rail, and we strongly endorse moving and advancing and modernizing rail And in fact, the International Energy Agency endorses electric rail to reduce fossil fuel consumption.
Yeah, and in my district, we have a Pacific Harbor Line. They've been a national leader in deploying zero emissions locomotive technology at the ports of Los Angeles and in Long Beach. So, I mean, what does this tell you about potential for cleaner rail operations when companies have the right incentives and support?
Yeah, absolutely. And there was incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act. There's been incentives and grants that are part of DERA that have updated and modernized locomotive equipment. So the technology is there. We just need to prioritize and push the industry to advance.
철도 분야도 마찬가지입니다. 이미 충분한 기술이 있음에도 결정권자들이 시간을 끄는 바람에 도입이 계속 늦어지고 있습니다.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We can all agree that clean air and clean water are non-negotiable, but regulations are intended to be a means to an end, not an end in themselves. And every regulation should be grounded in reality and tied to a clear environmental objective. We should also review them regularly to ensure that they remain current and relevant to the contemporary landscape. And so I thank all of you for being here today to help us in that endeavor. Mr. Conde, I'd like to start with you. I'd like to go back to the discussion of California's waiver authority and the kind of impact that that is having on the national market when manufacturers essentially have to build or manufacture to California specs and the effect that that has on regulatory costs in other states. So I am from Florida, and we are the third largest auto market in the country with 23 million residents, millions of vehicles purchased every year. Can you help us understand what repealing that waiver authority would mean economically for states like Florida?
Yeah, so there's no question that since California began its regulatory push to electrify everything in about 2012, car prices have exploded. They've increased by 50%. The median car price has increased by 50% since 2012, while incomes have only increased by half as much. So cars are becoming increasingly less affordable as automakers have to invest in sort of failed electrification policies. I think if California was out of the picture, consumers would be able to buy the cars they want and they would become more affordable. We've already seen that. In fact, prices have started to fall because of President Trump's deregulation. So I think cars would become more affordable to average middle-class Floridians.
결국 이런 비효율적인 규제들이 자동차 가격을 50%나 끌어올렸다는 분석이 나옵니다. 중산층의 경제적 부담이 커진 상황에 대해 책임 공방이 치열해집니다.
So I think it's extremely important to get those incentives back, and there are incentives for EVs and plug-in hybrids. And this actually brings up a previous point that I wanted to make. In terms of the regulations in California, as well as the previous federal regulations, those were not a mandate. They actually did include plug-in hybrids, and they were common sense approaches to transitioning from all fossil fuel vehicles over to cleaner vehicles.
Thank you, Ms. Garcia. My time's limited. I appreciate it. And I think that's the idea, that we want to incentivize these things while giving Americans options. A few years ago, I went to Korea and drove a hydrogen-powered vehicle. And one of my colleagues drove a tractor-trailer that was hydrogen-powered. We see Hyundai has a 250-mile range vehicle, 20-minute recharge. Toyota announced with High Road last year to deploy hydrogen fuel cell trucks. Volvo's in road testing, and Daimler is working with Cummins and Freightliner in Indiana and Oregon on a new hydrogen-powered trucks. Ms. Gelb, how far away you think are we as we get to the next 10, 20 years and seeing more hydrogen-powered truck, both engines and on the road?
Thank you for the question. The big issue of just in any technology transition for our industry, no matter what it is, whether it's a new clean diesel engine, battery electric, hydrogen fuel cell, hydrogen ICE, from the standpoint, it's making sure that technology is going to meet the operational needs for our customers, but also when we start talking about alternative technology, battery electric, hydrogen, making sure the infrastructure is in place.
Sure, and hydrogen's really probably has much more promise for the tractor trailers, it looks like at this point.
분위기가 무거워진 이때 의원은 다시 본인이 직접 확인한 대안을 제시합니다. 대한민국에서 경험한 수소차의 주행거리와 충전 속도가 얼마나 앞서 있는지 구체적으로 짚어줍니다.
What are some of the issues encountered from the use of DEF, and how has the Administrator Zeldin and EPA taken a pragmatic approach to fixing these?
Sure. Thank you very much for the question. I would say before the EPA guidance had been published last year, our customers, your farmers in your district would run into issue to where that equipment, if they had received an inducement, a notification of that there was an issue with the sensor, low DEF quality, not enough DEF, in the sense of, they could run into a place of exactly what you said. The equipment would stop running for them, it would shut down, and it would happen pretty quickly. It would be a severe derate of what we call it for the industry. Post the August guidance.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, with EPA's August guidance, they've been able to take the approach, and we were very supportive of this as the manufacturer, so where it gives a slower ramp down into that ability for the equipment to shut down. It gives more notices. They have longer periods of time now to where it doesn't happen in a short period of time. They aren't going from, let's say, from a place of where they were in the middle of planting their crop, and then suddenly it stops. They're able to finish that job, and they're able to get that equipment back home to be able to be serviced.
Thank you. What are the practical risks of leaving these guidance documents uncodified? And what would statutory clarity mean for diesel engine users and manufacturers moving forward?
Absolutely. So Mr. Ferguson has mentioned this a couple of times, but it's the most important thing for our customers and for manufacturers is regulatory certainty. So being able to design to something that we know that standard is going to be in place, but that also gives certainty to our customers, to your constituents, of making sure that they know what's going to be the requirement for tomorrow is the same requirement for today.
Thank you, Ms. Gelb. I yield the remaining of my time, and the chair now calls on my friend.
결국 가장 필요한 건 내일의 기준이 오늘과 같다는 믿음인 것 같습니다. 제도적 진통을 겪는 미국과 그들이 주목한 대한민국의 실력, 여러분은 어떻게 보셨나요? 오늘 영상은 여기까지입니다. 시청해주셔서 감사합니다.